Good afternoon, everyone. I am Sarah Rosen-Mortel, and I have the great honor of serving as the president of the Urban Institute. I want to thank all of you who are joining us from across the country. I want to thank you for caring about communities and equity. I want to thank you for your expertise from which we learn and your interest in how data, thoughtfully and ethically created and used in the right hands, can help us as a society advance justice and equality. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the Urban Institute, albeit virtually, and to this forum. Now, we've been at this virtual thing for over 20 months, but I still got to do the housekeeping notes. So as you probably know, this event is being recorded. The recording and the relevant links will be posted online after the event. We have turned on live captions, and if you want to turn them off for some reason, you may visit the live transcript icon on the bottom of your screen and toggle it. All participants are muted, but we'd love to hear from you. So please type your questions or comments into the questions box at any time, or if you prefer, you can email them to events@urban.org. We'll also ask you to participate in the post-event survey because it really helps us and the panelists hear what's on your mind, and it'll help shape what we do in the future. And if you want to join the conversation on Twitter, please use the hashtag #live@urban. Twitter handles of all the participants are on the Urban webpage for this event. And also there you'll find a bunch of relevant things that we've published about the use of data, trust, ethics, and responsibility that I think many of you would find of interest. So now the work to our topic today. Data has power. Data is not sufficient alone to drive change, but it can be an important contributor to the pursuit of equity and justice. Data can be used to eliminate racial inequities, to build consensus among stakeholders, and to advocate for shifts in policy and allocation of resources. But for it to do all this, data must not be used only to describe past and current inequities as if they were inherent, but rather it needs to be used to identify the systems and structures that created the disparities and inequalities and to chart a clear path to closing gaps and achieving fairness. Today's discussion is going to explore what local funders, coalitions, and advocacy organizations need to do differently to democratize data and ensure community members have what they need to use information to advance equity and well-being. Today's program also is a celebration. It commemorates the 25th anniversary of the National Neighborhood Indicators Partnership, known as NNIP, which is a learning network of 30 amazing independent organizations across the US that Urban is very proud to coordinate. These organizations all share a mission to ensure every community has access to the data and skills they need to use it to advance equity and well-being across its own neighborhoods. For Urban, NNIP connects our researchers to work in cities around the country, provides us with insight into what works from these amazing efforts that are on the ground, and then the participants get the benefit of Urban's shared insights from research in ways when they want to accelerate their own efforts. NNIP has long brought focus and attention to neighborhoods and promoted disaggregating data by race and by place. So just one example, during welfare reform, it was NNIP who demonstrated the spatial mismatch between jobs and the low-income workers and how they varied across places and across cities, and worried about how a sort of blanket policy might have differential effect in different places and on different communities. And today, NNIP works to showcase how to understand displacement risks and assess alternative responses that may work differently in different housing markets. I want to say a special thank you to the Annie Casey Foundation and its leader, Lisa Hamilton, who we will talk to in a few minutes, for their longtime support of NNIP and for being a champion of using disaggregated data to advance equity. So I'm going to introduce first Kathy Pettit, who is co-director of the NNIP. She's also a principal research associate in Urban's Metro Center, and she's passionate about letting the lived experience and learned expertise of local communities teach us all. And then after Kathy chats for a few minutes about NNIP, we're going to be joined by two fabulous leaders in this space and have what I know will be a great conversation. So Kathy, the virtual podium is yours.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for your time today. As Sarah mentioned, NNIP was founded 25 years ago when the original partners took the brand new GIS technology at the time to organize, map, and share neighborhood data with people with low incomes. And they saw that putting the data in the hands of the people gave them a tool to organize and advocate for themselves. Our partners also fostered community-wide data capacity by helping nonprofits, governments, philanthropy use data to improve people's lives and conditions in neighborhoods. In the mid-90s, the original partners came and asked Urban to house and grow the network. And starting with the leadership of our dear founding director, Tom Kingsley, today we have an incredibly strong community of practice of organizations in more than 30 places where we continuously exchange ideas and help each other do our work better. The world of data and technology has dramatically shifted since the early days. I believe our first hard drive with recommendation was 100 megabytes, but our partners are needed now more than ever to help their communities navigate the sea of data to get the particular piece of information to answer the question they have today. My co-director, Leah Hendy, and I are very grateful to be able to support the local partners, help new partners in new cities get started, and elevate the lessons that we're learning from the field to national audiences like you all. Our network has also recognized that an explicit focus on racial equity is needed to achieve our aspirations for all of our communities. Urban and partner staff have been working hard for the past few years to reflect on how our data practices were helping or hindering progress. And the latest step in this journey that I'd love to share with you was to co-develop and publish our goals for improving the use of data to advance equity. These include, for example, being really transparent about the biases and limitations, particularly of the administrative data we use, or including residents throughout the data process from design to dissemination. We are continuing to examine our practices together and lift up the promising examples, both from our partners and from our other great urban colleagues working on this issue too. We will share our insights with the field along the way and would love to hear from you all of examples from other organizations and places to learn from. So I'm very pleased today to hear Angela's and Lisa's perspective and glad we are able to bring their voices to you all. I hope the conversation prompts all of you to consider your role in using data to shift power and improve opportunities for people where you live. So I'll turn it back to Sarah.
Great, thank you, Kathy. And I am excited that I will be joined by the miracle of Zoom by Angela Glover Blackwell and Lisa Hamilton. We have, if you looked at the chat, there was a link to the bios for Angela and Lisa, and they probably need no introduction. But let me just quickly say that Angela, as many of you probably know, founded PolicyLink in 1999 to advance racial and economic equity for all. And if you haven't read The Curb Cut Effect, which she published in the Stanford Social Innovation Journal in 2017, it's one of the must-read products that many of her great works, but something I strongly recommend. In 1987, Angela founded the Urban Strategies Council in Oakland, which, as we just mentioned, was one of the first NNIP partners. She is a true innovator in equity, and I think we can say that much of the conversation that we're able to have today is one that is built upon a foundation that Angela has helped to build. Also enormously pleased to welcome Lisa Hamilton, who has now been a leader at the Annie Casey Foundation for a decade, having started as EVP and took over as president in 2019. She has led the formulation of their bold strategy on children, especially youth at risk, focusing on the young and also emerging adults in the South, and with a greater and greater focus on what helps to give power and efficacy to those who most need it to shape their own future. So tremendous, perfect people to talk about the role of data and what needs to complement it to make change for our communities. So thank you both for being here. Angela, I'm going to start with you because you were part of the birth of NNIP here. And I wanted to ask you sort of when you talk about, when you think about what it was that motivated you to join this, why it was that you saw data was an important tool in the council's early work to address persistent and concentrated poverty.
Thank you for the question, Sarah. Wonderful to be with you and always wonderful to be with Lisa. Happy to talk about this issue. Actually, when NNIP started, I wasn't at the Urban Strategies Council anymore. I was at the Rockefeller Foundation. And we were among the first funders of NNIP. And I can't tell you how gratifying it was to have gone from being at the Urban Strategies Council, really innovating about how to utilize data for change, and then to have the opportunity to fund a growing network and to see how far it has come. It's been really gratifying. So I want to tell you about why data was important when we started the Urban Strategies Council. I had been a public interest litigator before, and in our litigation, particularly Title VII employment discrimination work, we were always gathering data. Later, I did an administrative petition with a partner to the federal government to do something about infant mortality and the infant mortality gap, and worked with the UC Berkeley School of Public Health to pull together the data. So by the time I started Urban Strategies Council, I understood how powerful it was. But at that time, I was very influenced by the work of William Julius Wilson and what he was doing in terms of really lifting up the continuing complexity of urban poverty and looking at the concentration of race and concentration of poverty and what the two together were producing. And I say what the two together was producing because it was actually before we took on the language of how systems were producing what we were getting. We were falling into looking at concentrated poverty, sort of devoid of understanding the systems. But when we started the Urban Strategies Council, we used administrative data to create a visual presentation in Oakland, California, of what William Julius Wilson was talking about nationally. How was race being concentrated in poverty neighborhoods? How were issues like infant mortality, low birth weight, other issues being concentrated in those same places? And we were doing that with a base map in which we had shaded in 30% or more poverty neighborhoods, and then put transparent maps showing all these other things on top. For people who wonder, what century was that? Well, it was the 20th century. And it actually was 1988. After that, someone who was brilliant, Michael Wiseman from UC Berkeley, said, you know, I could take what you're doing to a whole new level. There's something new called GIS mapping. And he helped negotiate with the agencies how to get that data and show it using GIS mapping, which was the beginning of an explosion of community groups finding a whole new way to tell the story of what we were finding. So of course, Urban Strategies Council, even though I had left by that time, was an eager partner with NNIP to be able to find a network to help to innovate and to accelerate and to amplify something very important that we were picking up as a tool for social change.
Well, I love that story, and I hadn't heard it before, and I apologize for getting the origin story wrong. I've only been at this for 10 years here at Urban, but there are lots of themes in that story that I hope we'll come back to, including the relationship between the national strategy and the local story, and the focus on place and data that is so much the theme of today's conversation. So Lisa, both place and data are an important part of the story of the Annie Casey Foundation and still built into the strategies that you're working on now. When you got there, you really spent a lot of your energy first on the Kids Count program and network, which was all about understanding the power of data. So why don't we start with that sort of principle? What difference does it make, you think, that when people are able to use data in their advocacy, does it really make a difference to the results that we're able to get for children and families?
I think it makes a huge difference. And like Angela, I'm delighted to be with both of you, two sheroes in this field. What a pleasure to talk to both of you. I worked at UPS for 14 years before I came to the foundation, and we have a common founder in Jim Casey. And there is a saying at UPS, in God we trust, and everything else we measure. And so the company has this obsession with data that Jim Casey brought to the work of the Annie Casey Foundation, that we were going to work in service of kids and families, but we weren't going to do that in the absence of data that could help us make good decisions and help those we partner with make good decisions. And so one of the earliest and now most longstanding initiatives at the foundation has been the Kids Count Project. It started in 1990. And in fact, I'm sitting in front of a mural that commemorates the 30th anniversary of the Kids Count Project. And it was really based on this notion of democratizing data, that if you went to the Census Bureau and tried to make heads or tails of all the data that they collect, you would be, your head would hurt at the end of the day. And so the foundation's early leaders thought we've got to make this data more accessible, more available to a broad swath of the community. And so that was how Kids Count was born, that we knew we needed to support good data for good decision making, and we needed to make it more accessible to the wide range of stakeholders who needed this information. And so the Kids Count Project was born and is now 33 years old. And as you said, when I came to the foundation, that was the first project, one of the first projects I had the opportunity to be a part of. And in 2009, the foundation took what it was doing and made it digital and created the Kids Count Data Center. And so through that, tried to extend that effort of what this annual book was doing to make data available, again, to a broad base group of people. It's got 4 million data points in it. And, our last data showed 1.2 million people visited the Kids Count Data Center in 2020. So that tells me that it is abundantly clear that people want this information. This is not data that's being accessed just by agency leaders or legislators, but real people in communities who are using this information in order to drive their programmatic decisions, to use it in advocacy. And, the benefit we have of a network, a Kids Count network of advocates in every state across the country, they are proof positive to us that the data they gather at the state and local level, the way they use the National Kids Count data really enables them to be effective advocates for better outcomes for kids and families. And there isn't a place I go that I don't have a community member or a program director or even legislators sometimes say, thank you for making this data more accessible. I can just search, kids in poverty, or I can just search immigrant kids, and it gives me, real-time information about what's going on for kids. So it's in the core of our DNA and is why we've supported other efforts to strengthen the availability of public data like NNIP.
Well, you were just describing Kids Count, but you were describing the theory of change of NNIP. And although every one of the 30 organizations is different, there is a common sort of thread of theory of change here, which is that data can empower lots of different people in the ecosystem that drive change. But I wanted to kind of get at a question that the last 5 years have really challenged many of us on. We now are in a world where different people with different beliefs get access to different information. And some people, goodness gracious, my phone never rings. Sorry about that. And, we have a world where people talk about alternate facts, and that in some ways, social scientists have told us that people absorb information consistent with the worldview they come into. They use the information when they hear it, but they don't always hear the information that isn't consistent to the frame that they already have. So how do we think about, if we believe that data is as powerful as all of us do, how do we think about the current context and the role that data plays in persuasion and the role that data plays in empowerment? So Angela, do you want to start with that and we'll come back to Lisa? I know you have strong views on this.
Oh, so I can't believe I did that. That is a good, powerful, complex question. I want to just go back to Lisa for a minute, though, because I first got to know Lisa well as the Annie E. Casey Foundation was grappling with disaggregating the Kids Count data by race. That was such an important moment, and it continues to be important because unless we disaggregate data by race and place and other things that we know are important, we cannot solve the problems that people are concerned about. And so whether people like or dislike that move, it is important to keep doing it because we are not about a popularity contest. We are about finally rolling up our sleeves and understanding with nuance and specificity what's wrong, what's not just, what's not fair, what's holding the nation back, and how do we develop really smart strategies to deal with that? And I wanted to start answering your question that way because I don't think that we have a data problem. We have a racism problem in America. And we need to call it that because we can call it a data problem. We can call it a problem with critical race theory. We can call it a divided nation. No, we have a racism problem. And a huge swath of the nation has decided that we're going to address it. And that swath includes people who are white and Black and Indigenous and Latinx and Asian. It includes people from every part of the country. And there are a lot of people who don't want to go there. And we cannot let those people who want to hold on to racist ideas and practices and outcomes stop the nation from moving into the 21st century with a resolve to do better. But one thing that we haven't done, which gets at what you're asking, is we haven't used the data to be able to expand the numbers of people who want to make change, but haven't yet been given a narrative that they feel comfortable with. I now am associated with PolicyLink, and PolicyLink is very much associated with the National Equity Atlas. And the National Equity Atlas is focused on racial equity, and it is focused nationally and statewide and county and city. And it uses data to tell a story, I think a powerful story, about the future. It spends a lot of time looking at the changing demographics historically back to 1980 up to 2050. It then really looks at the economic issues, the vitality of the economy, the readiness of the economy, the connectedness within the economy, taking things like minimum wage and rent burden and distance to work, those kinds of issues, educational attainment. So we can see broken out by race, who's ready and who's not, who's a participant and who's not, who's burdened and who's not. And then at the end, it shows the economic benefit of getting racial equity right. So it doesn't hide the data. It says the demographic change is inevitable. This horse is out of the barn. It talks about what is happening that is going to hurt the nation if we don't get it right. And it looks at the extraordinary benefits, both for those who have historically been marginalized and left behind, but for everybody. I think we need to use data more to push a narrative. We need to not stop what we're doing that's finally letting us make the change we need. And we need to concentrate on expanding those who have some confidence that if we look at things with this kind of specificity, we can do better.
Lisa?
I wholeheartedly agree with Angela, and she's right. We first got to know each other well as I was thinking about how to evolve the Kids Count project, and the product that I'm really proud of that I helped to architect was Race for Results, that was first launched in 2014. And it was a recognition by me and many other people at the organization that we had not really taken on the issue of racial equity through the Kids Count project from a data lens in a way that could really help advance the conversation. And so our contribution to the conversation was this report that didn't just disaggregate the data by race, but really tried to partner that with a story about what had been happening in this country and the systemic barriers that were holding whole swaths of our child population back as the demographics were making us a more diverse country. And then turning that into an index that could then help us look at it differently. How could we not look at what was happening from just individual indicators, but how do we look at how this is collectively holding back millions of children to reach the aspirations we have for all of them? And so Angela and many other leaders were so instrumental in helping us figure out how to use this powerful platform of Kids Count and to evolve it to really be a tool for today and the challenges that we felt we were facing around racial equity. And so I'm really excited that that was a project that could be a part of. And I think it goes to what Angela says, that we don't need less data, we need more data to combat misinformation and to be innovative in the ways that we utilize that data and tell the story so that, again, it is a narrative people can understand and have the data and information that sits behind it in order to bolster those advocacy efforts.
So I want us to come back later to talk a little bit more about the power that we get from disaggregating data. But you used a terrific line, Lisa, picking up on Angela, which was this idea of data helps us to tell stories. People connect to the narrative and then they absorb the data. So that's really exciting. But data is telling the story not only of society, but of individual people. Data is telling people's stories. And yet too often the people whose stories are represented have the least to say about how their data is collected, how it's used by others. Often they don't even have access to the data that we then collect or the support skills and resources to use it to advocate for themselves or to meet their other needs. And we know that people who've been marginalized, and that's often people of color, people in low incomes, they've not only been shut out of the opportunities to access data, but they're sometimes harmed by how other people who get that data then use it irresponsibly. So as we think about, and I think this audience today is a movement of people who think about using data in local communities, what do we need to be thinking about first principles about how data is used, and specifically with keeping in mind our responsibility, the people whose stories are being told. Lisa, do you want to start?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I think that is such an important issue and one that we have been grappling with for a number of years and have actually tried something that I think we have found pretty successful. We started a project about 6 years ago called Evidence to Success. And I don't know if you've heard of it or not, but it was really born out of this idea that so often school systems were making decisions about programs to implement in schools without a full understanding or a full accounting of the data they were using to make those decisions and with no input from community and as they made them. And so we decided to pilot a project called Evidence to Success, which really says we're going to build the capacity of not just the school system, but public systems in these communities to better partner with their community to look at data and to make collective decisions, that there really wasn't an infrastructure for that, a framework for that. And we thought that's going to help lead to better decisions at the end of the day. We started the pilot in Providence, Rhode Island. We've since gone to a number of other cities, Salt Lake City, Mobile, Alabama, Selma, Alabama, and the results have been just phenomenal in the sense that we have a youth survey that we ask young people, what's going on in your life, both positive things and challenging things. And then we've created a process where public systems and residents sit down together and look at that data and say, what is it telling us about young people? What do we need to be investing in order to help these young people move forward in their lives, achieve the academic success and well-being that we want for them? And it has been so enlightening to see the ahas that have happened for the health system leaders, the school system leaders, the juvenile justice leaders, to see what's really happening in young people's lives and to hear the perspective and interpretation of community members about what it's actually saying they ought to invest in, and then have a joint decision-making process about what are the programs that might help deal with the depression that the young people in our community are saying that they have? What are the opportunities we have to create more culturally relevant programming for the Latinx young people in our community? And then investing the dollars that might have gone in totally different directions towards solutions that are having a tremendous impact on young people. So I agree with you that there are very rarely the kinds of infrastructure or capacity building for particularly public system leaders or nonprofits to engage community. And I will count Evidence to Success as just one contribution Casey is trying to make, and to make those tools more broadly available, to say there is a mechanism by which we can bring community to the table, look at this data collectively, and make better decisions that are going to lead to the kinds of outcomes that we want to have. So I do think it's very possible.
Angela?
I love that, to be able to utilize data for success and to be able to really craft solutions. And I want to emphasize the role of advocates in the change process. That it used to be that data got gathered by government agencies because it was a requirement for those agencies to get more money. And they gathered the data, they sent it off, and the data was not used to design programs. The data was not used to inform community about progress. It just was a cycle that just went on. Advocates started getting access to that data to make a point about problems. So you had advocacy organizations that were using data to tell sad, horrible, true stories about what was going on in communities. Communities didn't particularly like that. They didn't like being portrayed that way. They didn't like the way that they came off. But I found that when advocates worked with communities, communities were happy to get data to be able to push for what they wanted. So that communities and advocates started working together, not just to being part of the story of what's wrong, but they became part of the story of what we need to do. Now, when we think about data now, I think some of the rules that actually get at what you're talking about are designing these data tools and projects in partnerships with advocates who often are proximate to community and know what communities are pushing for, to be able to bring that advocacy point of view in, as well as the respect for the people whose lives will be impacted. Sharing ownership of the data is so important. Being able to not just allow this to be owned by the Research Institute, but to make it broadly available. Being able to compensate community-based organizations and research partners. I mean, this is money that university people are getting to be able to do the research, and then the people who are helping them gather it get nothing. We need to change that so that people are able to actually continue to have strength. But then making sure that the data is used for innovative advocacy, like evictions, being able to show what's going on, being able to look at the economic benefits of dealing with rent burden issues, really looking at the benefits of full employment to be able to push something. And we have found at PolicyLink that our data is so much richer, it is so much more fulfilling to bring it along when we are working hand in hand with people who are planning campaigns, because we know it's going to be useful. And they love that we can provide something that they don't have the resources and shouldn't be taking their advocacy time away from campaign work to be gathering this data. But when you're doing it in partnership, it's powerful.
Couldn't agree more. And just one other example of what you're talking about, Angela. Often the expertise of people from the community helps you interpret and understand the data in ways that researchers at afar could never possibly. So if you sit down and collect and then actually analyze the information, there's all kinds of expertise, and I often say lived experience is evidence. And we need to think of all of those contributions as part of how we draw conclusions from the research. So I think Angela just talked about the power of advocates. So I'm going to ask you, Lisa, to talk about the importance of how philanthropy it thinks about data and its role. What roles can you play, because you're funding all kinds of partners who are working in communities, to ensure that the data is democratized and that they're using the kind of practices that Angela was just talking about?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There are a number of things philanthropy can do. We can certainly invest in making sure there are good data sources. We have a whole area of investment around strengthening public data, which says, how can we make sure we've got the most rich, most robust sources of information at all the different levels that it needs to happen, and to use our influence to ensure that that data is disaggregated by race and ethnicity and other different cuts of the data we might need in order to make good decisions, but also that we are gathering data that is the right sort of data. And I think that again goes to how community can help inform what we need to be looking at. I was speaking to a colleague earlier today, and he said we've got to measure what we treasure. And I'm holding on to that today because it's so true that we don't often measure what we treasure. We're often measuring disparities or challenges or things that are wrong. And there is so much work we've got to do to push our data collection apparatus to focus more on the positives and the assets, because so often that's the place we need our investments to be going. And if we could see how they where they exist and how they need to be expanded. I think we could do a lot more in that regard. And then I think this other issue of building capacity, that's a really important role philanthropy plays, is in building the capacity of a wide range of partners to utilize this data, whether it's our advocacy partners. I can't tell you how much we've invested in, trying to help partners like Kids Count understand racial equity and understand their role in advancing racial equity. That's an important capacity building investment that we think will reap benefits. But even talking about public system partners, how do we build their muscle in order to collect the right kind of data and utilize it? So I think there are a wide range of roles that we can play, from investing in sort of innovative data sources to trying to make sure that we strengthen the public data collection apparatus, to building the capacity of all of the members of the ecosystem to utilize that data.
I love that. And I think in some ways what you're talking about, both of you, is strengthening the decision-making and how to build into decision-making a look at the equity implications of choices that, whether it's a community group is making, a service provider is making, a local government is making. How do you measure whether your policy change is advancing equity, or maybe in ways you don't even understand, hardening inequalities that we have? And that's certainly something that the Biden executive order in many cities are increasingly mandating, is that you look at. We need data for those stories. But one of the challenges we face is that the data we collect can reflect the biases that have shaped the world we're describing, right? I mean, if you use information about populations and communities and geographies that are already describing the result of systems and structures that disadvantage, then you're trying to predict the future, there's a risk that you actually bake those biases, inequalities into the future. And certainly predictive analytics and automated decision-making, that we're seeing all kinds of sort of scary consequences of that now. Here we are, people saying they can't find anybody to apply, and yet workers over 50, particularly older workers of color, are seeing no one ever even looks at their resume. We know that there are a set of choices that sometimes data can actually help people make that are bad for community. So I'm really interested in, how do you think about purging, if you will, the bias from the data, or at least shining a spotlight on it? Angela?
I think we use the data to shine the spotlight. Like you just said something that was very enlightening, that people of color over 50 not getting jobs, that's one way to put it, but people who are hiring not looking at resumes of people of color over 50. We can say that African-American families can't get loans to buy homes, but we could look at some data that's saying banks refuse to give loans to Black families that are trying to start out. So now that we have a notion of what it means for racism to be systemic and structural and baked in, we need to start measuring that. And if we start measuring that, we can tell a powerful story about what's wrong. So we still need to talk about the problems. We still need to talk about the results of injustice, because we can never stop understanding the magnitude of it. That's what always gets to me about the data, because as a Black person who grew up in the Black community, I've got anecdote after anecdote. I can tell you about what's happened to people that I have known. But when you look at it, you realize that wasn't isolated. That happened in Chicago and Newark and Gary, Indiana, and Jackson, Mississippi. So we need to keep telling that story, because until we understand the magnitude of the problem, we don't understand the magnitude of the investment. But at the same time, we need to look at the magnitude of the unjust actions. When you look at all the banks, when you look at all the employers who have been systematically, continuously discriminating against Black people, when you look at the wealth gap that exists between people who are Black and white, and then you go back and systematically look at all the things from redlining to bank lending to all of those things, it's a different story. So my suggestion is that we not shy away from telling the problems with data, but that we add a capacity to talk about how we got there with data, who's complicit in getting there and how much of a change we need to make to move forward. This isn't going to happen with a couple of $1 billion. This is a multi-trillion-dollar challenge, and we need to be aligning the dollars with the challenge.
Lisa,
Could I just weigh in on this? I totally
Yeah.
agree with Angela on that. And, one of the things I think that we lack in our data narrative is about system data, that we are often trying to tell the stories or understand the challenges or solve them just from the sort of aggregated individual data. But if we don't understand how systems are functioning and the kinds of opportunities they do or don't create, that's where the equity story starts. And I agree with Angela that we've got to think more about that systemic look at things rather than, where are the banks? Where are they lending? Not just who didn't get a loan. It's a very different lens on that data that I think really unlocks the equity challenge that we have. And your question about predictive analytics and bias is one that is, I have to say, so top of mind for me, over the last 5 to 10 years, I'd say, it has become apparent how many aspects of our lives are going to be decided by algorithms. I describe it as sort of the FICO score, which determines our credit worthiness for everything on steroids. And so as more and more of these analytics are getting rolled out, it's an issue that we are paying serious attention to at Casey, and in fact have figured out a point of view, especially around the equity issues there, because of our concern that so many of the biased decision-making techniques that are used by humans are being embedded into these algorithms. And if we don't make sure that they are transparent, if we don't make sure that they are used in helpful ways and not just harmful ways, we are going to see an accelerator for an accelerant for so many of the bad outcomes that we have been trying to predict. There's going to be this, mechanism to do that even faster and more harmful ways. So it's something we all ought to be really mindful of in this data conversation, is about how these analytic tools are developed and utilized.
Well, and the argument you're making is for transparency, I think, in understanding these and being able to use data to interrogate whether or not the different algorithms we're looking at could actually be hardening inequalities, or whether they're actually built on a set of assumptions that are systemically racist and biased. The simplest example of what we're talking about here is if you imagine you make a decision about where to allocate resources based on who calls 911 or the equivalent, 311. Well, what kinds of systems of trust exist and who's going to participate in the system? So you really have to look at the source of data and explore whether or not it in itself reflects some of the biases that we think about. I wanted to ask you also briefly to each talk about who owns data. How can we, if you're a neighborhood organization, we've talked about who gets to use data. People exploit data for profit, whether it's administrative records or my transactions every time I, do something, I stream another Netflix video. That information is used then by someone else. How do we start to think about this as an asset that should be owned, especially by the underserved communities that we're talking about here, to help achieve benefit? Do you have thoughts on that, either of you?
I have thoughts on it, and I want to pick up on what Lisa was saying and come back to it, because what Lisa was just describing is a fundamental problem with the internet and the way that data is being utilized and collected. And while we can try to figure out how to operate at the end of that and try to correct harms, we're experiencing the beginning of the Internet 3.0. We had the Internet 1.0, which actually allowed us to access data. And then we had 2.0, which actually allowed us to connect with each other. And that got completely hijacked and owned by just a few companies that have just added to the extreme inequality in society and created a lot of problems that we're now experiencing. As we think about Internet 3.0, we need to be at the front end of that. We need to actually understand what the protocols need to be so that we'll have transparency, so we'll know where data is coming from, so we'll have a way to be able to check it out. I'm involved with something called Project Liberty that is trying to do just that. So I just want to encourage people to think about getting on the front end of those protocols. But then I want to come back to your question, because it is so important, not just who owns the data, but how is the data used and who decides? There's a wonderful project in San Francisco called San Francisco's Stop Secret Surveillance Ordinance. And what it does is it actually creates a way for people to be able to know surveillance data that's being gathered, to be able to make decisions about gathering that data, to talk about who can have access to it, how it's utilized. There's a wonderful woman at the University of Florida, Dr. Jasmine McNeely, who is involved in trying to develop something called data trust, so that we can actually have monetary value and financial benefits go to communities, so that you have a board of directors that actually gets to have access to the data, to make judgments about the data, to be able to control the data for a geographic area and the people within it, and be able to extract financial support for them. We need to explore that kind of work more. We need to think about civil rights compliance with data, and also be able to have a way that is easily known and accessible, that you can contest data, because bad data gets out there and people have no way to do anything about it. So I think that your question about ownership is a good one. But ownership almost comes too late in the process. We need to be at the front end, thinking about how it's all getting assembled and making available, and how's the internet playing a role? How do we decide what gets used? How do we get government in the governance of all of this and make it accountable to the people?
Well, I want to say just a word to the audience who is furiously sending us fabulous, fabulous questions. And I'm going to try to weave and aggregate some of them into the discussions here, because there's so much great material. One of the things that I learned from the NNIP community was that so much of our work initially on open data and was about government creating and publishing its information. But it's equally important that there be a dialogue between lots of different parties with access to data. And that's in the public, it's in the advocacy, and it's in private actors as well, who are typically very good at collecting this. But if the data is not disaggregated, some people don't have the same voice. So there's questions in the chat about the Asian American community. And the Asian American community is not a community. The Asian American community is so many communities, as is the African American community, as the Latinx community. There are so many different stories and community stories in that data. So how do we think about disaggregation? And at the sample size requirements for public data have to be so huge. There are interesting, innovative data science techniques to start to impute data, take a data set that does have racial differences and compare it with ones that do not have that kind of fine grain. And but how important is, and do you have good stories about telling all the different stories in the data that aggregated data may fail to story? Lisa, you're nodding your head, so why don't you jump in?
I am, because it was an issue we grappled with Race for Results when we were working on it. And we are adamant that you ought to disaggregate the data to the finest extent that you can. And so often we see organizations just to give up if they aren't able to do it on the state level. Well, then if you can do it at the city level, do it at the city level. And so even as we were doing Race for Results, to your point, the Asian Pacific community is not a monolith. And so we took the time to say, here's what's happening with the Hmong community. Here's what's happening with the Vietnamese community. We needed to make sure that to the extent we could, how could we tell a finer grained story about what was happening in different communities? Same with the Latino community. You can't just, have one monolithic story. And so we are passionate advocates for the fact that that data needs to be refined even more clearly. African Americans are not, a monolith. There are different experiences and stories for African immigrants as compared to African Americans, native born African Americans. So I think there is a lot to be said about disaggregating in a more fine cut. It often can't be done at the national level, but that's why projects like NNIP are important, because when you get down to the neighborhood level, you can often get that more refined data, and that's what we need to make better decisions.
And Angela, as you take this up, and maybe Lisa, you want to jump in on this too, there are a bunch of comments in the chat about the specific challenges of less densely populated places, rural communities, and the real challenges of being able to tell reliable and responsible data there. So Angela,
yes, I just wanted to, thank you. I just wanted to add to what Lisa said, Indigenous people too, that is so important. And that data often is the sample problem, and there's a sovereignty issue, which people often forget in terms of that data. So important. And we have, you will find on the National Equity Atlas, really fine disaggregation, Indigenous, Asian, and within the Latinx community. I do think that rural is so important. It is part of the narrative that we're trying to tell, because so often the problems in an urban community, like access to fresh fruits and vegetables, access to jobs, those are exactly the issues in rural communities. And so we need to always pull that in and just overcome the challenge geographically. The geographic is a problem, but it is something that can be overcome. And because we were so involved at PolicyLink in trying to get more access to fresh fruits and vegetables and get the Healthy Food Financing Initiative in place, and so many of the senators who we hope would support it were representing places where they had to respond to rural, we got that rural data. The same is true with promised neighborhoods, that a lot of the communities that actually needed promised neighborhoods were in rural communities. So not only is it possible, but it's absolutely essential to be able to show how these challenges that we often associate with people of color include people of color in rural communities and people in rural communities who are not of color, who very much care about these issues.
So I want to try to cover two things in the 7 minutes we have left. I want to talk briefly about the census. We have a number of questions and comments on the census. Urban is very proud that the Senate just voted to confirm the incoming first Latinx leader of the Census Bureau, Rob Santos, who will be starting in January there, one of our longtime colleagues. But there is real questions about trust in the census after the last year. So I want to ask you guys to reflect on it, and then we're going to do one hope for the future question in the end. So Lisa, do you want to start, just reflect on the census for a moment?
I'd love to talk about the census. It's one of our favorite things to advocate around. Casey is part of a census funders group that brought together almost $200 million to focus on getting an accurate count. The group of people who are most often undercounted are young children under the age of 5. And certainly in communities of color, that issue was even more exacerbated. And so it was a critically important issue to us in the work that we do to make sure that all children were counted as a part of the census. And that group came together to really figure out where to focus outreach to make sure that as many people as possible completed the census. And that's where data came in handy again, because we were able to look at census tracts and figure out where were there undercounts based on ways that we could compared data from different types of sources. And that funding group really was integral in trying to help increase the census count. We know that there continue to be important issues to work on the census, making sure that the census infrastructure is rebuilt and that it's modernized. We just had our first online census. I'm sure there's a lot that we have learned that we will need to digest going forward. We can always expect there will be changes to the race and ethnicity categories, and making sure that those are as fine-tuned as possible, new privacy technology. And we use the American Community Survey to do the kids count data. We want to make sure that that very vital data source is continued and strengthened. So though we have just completed the 2020 census, we know there is a lot of work to be done to be ready for 2030, and want to keep this group of funders and stakeholders together to continue to make the investments that we think are needed to do that.
Well, and that census funders group helped to support a product we put out 2 weeks ago that essentially was a simulation model of the census to help us understand state by state where some of those real miscounts are. So thank you for that. Angela, census?
No, I just agree with everything Lisa said. I'm so happy for the Census Funders Group, and more support even needs to go to the advocacy groups and the neighborhood groups for what they're doing. But the direction in terms of funders understanding how important this issue is for what it is they're hoping to do, that has really happened. And I think we'll see more and better going forward. So important.
I'm thrilled, Lisa, to hear you say that it's time to get to work on the 2030 census, because we tend to sort of turn away until it's almost too late to be able to influence the methods and the techniques and the real community input. And we saw a lot of those problems last time when we, by the time it came along, there weren't the right advocates for the Beth methods who were able to support the Census Bureau and its efforts. So I'm going to end with a discussion about the vision for the role of data in the future. It's hard for us to entirely know how technology is going to change, but we do believe that you started this conversation with your faith that giving people access to data, empowering people to use data is part of the world we want to create. It will help to make it happen. So what's your vision for how people will be using data to solve problems and strengthen communities 25 years later when we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of NNIP? Angela?
Oh, I'm glad you let me go first, because I don't have much to say about this. I'm going to see what Lisa has to say. 25 years out, I hope that we're not still talking about these same things. I know that's close in, but it's also far out. And we have so much technological capacity and so much resolve right now. My hope is that I can't anticipate what the data issues are going to be, because we will have moved so far beyond the things that have engaged me up till now.
Lisa, you get the last word.
Wow, I hope that equity is at the center of how we're using data, that we have gotten so much better at understanding how systems function, and that we can, using new technology and new strategies, very quickly root out when there is a systemic barrier that's holding back whole communities of people, that we can quickly use the data to make progress there, and that we're able to tell better stories about the assets and strengths of people and not just the challenges that they have. So I'm hoping we're where Angela is saying we are, that we will have solved a lot of the things that are holding us back today, but that we are in a position to not spend decades trying to fix them in the future, but that we've got the capacity to fix them much more quickly.
Well, so my wish is that each generation has its versions of Lisa Hamilton and Angela Glover Blackwell. So whatever challenges come their way in the use of data, and that they have leaders to help the field see the way forward to use data to achieve better outcomes. We're really privileged to have you with us. I'm thankful to the audience for being with us. And let me just say in closing, my great appreciation to the urban team at NNIP for the work they do to support the amazing leaders around the country who are all these different data organizations. How can it not be, how can the future you wish for not come true with these amazing talents? Thank you all for being here. Have a great day.
Thank you.